Dwyer. I am the Festival Director of Bray Literary Festival. So we have reached the final event of our Festival 2020, and I'd like to thank all of the people who have made it possible. The writers, the viewers, and of course our sponsors for making this happen. I would also like to thank the Bray Literary Festival Committee, who have adapted and worked tirelessly to deliver this year's festival online. This has been a departure for everybody, as it has been for those who run other festivals. So if you've enjoyed this year's events, we would encourage you to donate via our website, www.brayliteraryfestival.com. And now for the final act of Bray Literary Festival 2020. We bring you three of Ireland's finest writers. Christine Dwyer Hickey is a multi-award-winning novelist, short story writer and playwright. Prizes include the Kerry Group Irish Novel of the Year, the Irish Short Story of the Year, the Walter Scott Historical Prize for Fiction, and the Dalkey Literary Award. Her novel, Tatty, is the Dublin One City, One Book 2020 choice, and this event has been kindly sponsored by One City, One Book. Billy O'Callaghan is a novelist and short story writer from Douglas, County Cork. My Coney Island Baby won the Irish Book Awards Novel of the Year and has been translated into 8 languages. It was also shortlisted for the Encore Award. His short story collection, The Boatman and Other Stories, had the title story shortlisted for the Costa Short Story Prize. This event is moderated by one of Dublin's best-loved writers, Dermot Bolger, who is a poet, a playwright, novelist, and most recently, a short story writer. His most recent book, Secrets Never Told, is a collection of short stories which has just been published by New Island Books. So we would like to thank you once again for tuning in to all of our events this year. Thank you so much, and hopefully we will see you again next year.
It's a huge pleasure. It's a pity. It will be a bigger pleasure to be in Bray as part of the Bray Literary Festival, but it's a huge pleasure to be in my living room in Drumcondra speaking to two of my favourite writers, Billy O'Callaghan in Cork and Christine Dwyer Hickey in Palmstown in Dublin. And today we're talking about two books that are very different in many ways. Tatty, which is the One City, One Country book for Dublin, and Billy O'Callaghan's My Coney Island Baby. And some ways they're linked in that they both have families. They're both families at the centre. The narrator is part of a family, and yet he's centre of the family and on the fringes of the family in both books. The narrators of both books, they create alternative worlds in which to hide part of themselves away from disappointment, often trauma. In Cathy's case, it's an imaginary world which a child invents to actually cope with the alcoholism of their parents. She invents friends and locations, and she's able to, she has a future to look forward to, and when she's finished his childhood, she goes on into this other world, and Tatty explores that really, really well in 10 chapters, each covering a year in the life of the child as she goes from around 4 up to around 14, and slowly comes to an awareness of the world. In Billy's book, My Coney Island Baby, we have a couple who are not a couple, who are Michael and Kathleen, who and they're also retreating to an alternative world from the world they live in. The world they live in is two disappointing marriages, or two marriages that have gone stale or gone flat over time, and their respite is both physical and sexual, but it's far beyond sexual. It's about creating a neutral space where they can be different from the other lives, or maybe they can be truer versions of themselves, and that space is a rented room on Coney Island where they meet once a month and have done so for 25 years. I'm going to talk to Billy first. Hello, Billy. And you were known firstly for 3 very brilliant books of short stories. I know your most recent book is a book of short stories as well. And My Coney Island Baby has a lot of, it is absolutely a novel, and it is a superb novel, but it has a lot of the characteristics of the short story in its deliberate use of understatement, in its deliberate way that it actually fringes it ends the book in a way that is almost a hinge that we're not quite sure what actually happens next. And it actually is a brilliant book, not just for what it says, but for what it leaves out. And was that your intention in some ways, to actually write a book where you were very much in control of how much of the world the audience could see?
Oh, it's a big question. I mean, the truth of it is, when I started writing this book, it was a short story. I had written it originally as a short story. It hadn't really been my intention to write a novel. Mainly because I didn't think I was capable of writing a novel. I had just written short stories all the time. And so I had written the short story and I had published the story. And I just found that it didn't leave go of me in the way that usually when I write a short story, it's on to the next one and, it's out of my head. But this one kept kind of bugging me. And it just felt that it wasn't written sufficiently, it wasn't full enough. And so eventually I just started writing little pieces just for myself. I had no intention originally of writing it as a novel.
And were those pieces in sequence, or were they random pieces where the characters just spoke to you?
Well, originally they were random pieces. I think what I was looking for originally was that I might find another short story with these two characters in it. But over time, I'd say I'd been working on it on and off, only as a kind of a sideline, for about 2 years before I could kind of admit to myself that this thing was trying to be a novel. And I spent a long time writing it. I spent about 7 years writing it, mainly because I kept putting it aside to write other things. But I just couldn't get away from it. I had these characters there all the time.
Was part of that a fear of just writing a novel? Because I remember, like, somebody I knew phoned me from a cottage in Clare, and they always wanted to write a novel. And they were meeting that wall that you meet perpetually. You meet wall after wall after wall. And she said, I just can't finish it. And I said to her two things. I said, if you ride the Tour de France, which is on at the moment, or finishing at the moment, I mean, every day you have to go over the Alps. Every day, you have to. If you finish an hour behind the lead rider, you're expelled. If you collapse and you can't go up, you're expelled. So everybody who gets to the last day in Paris on the Champs-Élysées has in some ways won the Tour de France, because they've got through the whole thing. And anybody who finishes a novel, whether a novel is published or not, has got through those walls, has got over their private Alps. And I said to her, you must finish it for your own sake, and also you must finish it because Penguin in America have paid you $1 million for it, and you don't want to give the money back. And her name was Nuala Phelan, and at the time her memoir was #2 in the New York Times bestsellers, and yet she still had that same sense of terror of the novel form, in a way that some people have a terror of poetry. I just want to bring Christine in before I ask you to read, because Christine, you began with short stories as well and winning the Listowel thing. But then, was there a big jump for you in your mind of, say, moving from a short story, which is a very controlled form, to going out and expanding it into the world of novels where you're primarily working now?
Yeah, and I think it shows maybe in my first novel, The Dancer, it's sort of, they're like a series of short stories, really. It sort of has that arc and that shape of a short story, every chapter. And I do both. And I always find that when I go from the novel to writing a short story, the short stories are huge, like there's no end to them. And when I start a novel after having written short stories for a while, it has a different shape, so it's a different canvas, and you have to kind of gradually allow yourself to expand or to fit the canvas that you're going to work on. But I thought that was interesting what Billy said about the unfinished business of having a short story and not being, because that's happened to me twice. It happened to me with Tatty, and it happened to me with The Cold Eye of Heaven, where I couldn't leave the characters behind and they kept talking to me. And then I said, well, that's it. They want more attention, obviously. So I go with the novel.
When I was growing up back in the 1850s, there was this sense that the short story was Ireland's national art form. And this myth was perpetuated, and there was a sense that it suited the Irish temperament, because it was to do with economics and censorship, in that because Joyce had left and written Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, and Beck had written this great trilogy. But there was the short story suited an Ireland of the 1940s and 50s that had no indigenous publishers, that actually had small magazines, and where you were less likely to be censored and banned for writing a short story, because, as Frank O'Connor said, the short story happened essentially in a week, and everybody went to confession in Ireland once a week, so you only had a week to commit sin. So it suited narrative, but there was always a sense of us being afraid of the actual novel. And so, Billy, was there great liberation then in actually suddenly, because I've just written this little book of short stories myself, and a lot of them were commissioned for like BBC Radio 4 and things, and so they were very, very tight. They had to be like 2,100 words.
Yeah.
And this time I've written them like they're 9,000 words. They're actually 8,000 words. They just finally have the length to speak in their own way, and speak in a way that people don't speak in short stories because they don't have time. And did you find that as you began to realize this wasn't a second short story, this was a bigger book, that these characters began to surprise and do things that you weren't expecting?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's funny, because when I look at the book now, when I think about it, in some ways it feels like a long time ago, because I finished it about 4 or 5 years ago. I don't remember when, but both of those characters now, the male and female character in the book, they both feel like me. I can see myself in those characters very much so. Other people that know me wouldn't necessarily see it, but I can see how much of myself went into those characters. So I think a lot of it was a sort of an exploration to kind of get to know myself a bit better. I honestly never thought anybody would publish it. A few publishers turned it down, agents turned it down, and it just sat in a drawer. While I wrote it, I wrote a ghost story, a short novel, which was really like a short story. I wrote it as a story, but it just kept getting longer. And it was, it did something for my short stories as well, writing this book, because it made me go into the characters in a deeper way than maybe I had previously. So I suppose we're all, we're learning all the time, but at no point do I ever feel like I know what I'm doing. It's always a struggle. It always seems like I'm kind of, reaching in the dark. But at a certain point, it just starts to come together. I mentioned that I had written a lot of pieces in putting this book together initially in an early draft of it. And the reason it took so long was I couldn't stop writing it. I kept writing and writing. Like the finished version was probably 30,000 or 40,000 words shorter than one of the drafts had been. It was just unwieldy. And I got to a point where it was stopping me writing other things that I wanted to write. So what I did was I printed out the whole manuscript in single space, very, very small font, 9 or 10 point font. And I cut out every paragraph. And I went to my parents' attic. It was just a bare attic, and I blue tacked the entire novel along the eaves of the wall. And every day for about 3 weeks, I would come down to the house, and in the morning I would start at page 1 and I would read all the way through, and I would take down little scraps of paper and make notes and move things around. It was just like cutting and pasting, but it was in a more tactile way. And it was only when I got to the end of that, after about 3 weeks, that I started to realize the insanity of what I was at. And at that point, I knew I was really finished, and it was time to stop with it. And that was the only way I was able to let go of it. So
and that's also how they make the final cut in films, because I at different stages of my life, different novels of mine were option film. Like they're never made, but I got to see a lot of producers' bedrooms, and they always had big suites. I could never figure out why they need these big suites. So when they finally finished it, when they have driven 16 writers to mint it, and they finally have the finished script of the film, and everything is perfect, they then do a thing where they actually write down in 4 or 5 words what happens in every scene. And they put them all along the wall of the bedroom suite. That's why they're the big rooms. And then they walk along the wall, and they sort of say, but if you took out scene B, would the audience jump from scene A to scene C? Would they, you know, and they find these shortcuts, and sometimes putting things out in that sort of way and looking at them in the totality, you begin to see the shortcuts and to see the clues. And sometimes I also think writing things not sequentially is very interesting. And somebody who was Christine was very familiar with as a figure in her childhood was Patrick Kavanagh, who was greatly befriended and helped by her father and was part of the family at different times. And I remember talking to Tony Cronin one time, and he said that he met Patrick Kavanagh when Kavanagh was writing Tabby Flynn, and he said, "How's Tabby Flynn going?" And he said, "Oh, beautiful. I wrote this lovely description. Tabby's in a field. The sun is shining. He's chewing on a piece of grass. He's thinking about women. It's a beautiful piece, you know." And he met him a few weeks later and said, "How's the novel going?" And he says, "I can't get that fecker out of that field." You know, the mechanics of just how people move. And sometimes when I'm writing a novel, it's a bit like the engine of a Ford Fiesta car in my garage, if I had a garage. In that it's all these bits and pieces that you slowly put together, and that by virtue of not writing necessarily sequentially, that you actually get that freedom away from the mechanics of the plot to actually get to the heart, the emotional heart of the characters. But I don't know, Christine, when you're writing Tatty, if you did it year by year, or if you actually sort of moved around in your mind as you're writing bits, as you, or did it just come out more or less the way it was fully written?
I wrote Tatty, I think, in a different way to anything else, in that I kind of, the only way I could write it was to come out, sort of leave my own head and just do it and not think about it too much. Or I wouldn't have done it, because I think it's such a personal story. I would have chickened out. So I knew that I was interested in the voice developing and the child's perception developing, so I had to move forward. And I thought, I don't know how it came to me to do that. I'm still thinking about Billy's thing in the attic. I think that's a brilliant idea. I often do it on a big table and look at what I've done. Or I draw the shape of the novel. I try to draw the shape, and if the shape is wrong, it's just mad. You can't really explain it, can you, what you do? But the attic is a very good idea. I'd have to get James up there now to clean ours out. That's his job now, his next job.
He'll thank me for that. So
Billy, love you, Billy. He love you.
A bearded man doesn't want to know you. A bearded man doesn't want to. I'm just, because I know that a lot of people won't have actually read the 2 books, and just of getting a flavour. Billy, could I ask you to read a small extract from my Coney Island Baby, and maybe contextualise where it is? What's fascinating about the book is that it all happens within the space of one afternoon. But it also happens over the space of like 30, 40 years. It goes right back in there's a present time where they're going through the motions of meeting and sort of going to the hotel and sort of, it's hardly even a hotel, and making coffee and talking and making decisions and sort of, and then they're moving backwards and top. It moves very fluidly in time in a remarkable way, back to the Inish Boffin of his childhood, to her marriage, to sort of him losing a child when he was not long married, and so much is going on there, you know. But which piece did you pick to read, Billy?
I picked when they arrive in the hotel room. It's the beginning of chapter 3. It's called "In the White Room," which is the Cream song. You know, does a Cream have a song called "The White Room"? And that was just
they arrive in a hotel to commit adultery, but nobody's watching this is to practice this at home unless under strict medical supervision.
Well, okay. You know, I'm not a judge, so I'm not a priest. I'm not here to judge these people, but they can do what they like. But this is the just the first couple of pages of that chapter. The room is small but immediately becomes theirs. Caitlin enters first, glances around, feeding on detail. The nape of her neck is shown just for a moment as a white slope before she turns her head again and the loose curtain of her casual ponytail falls back into place. Michael leans the weight of his body to the door until the lock clicks shut. He delights in watching her, a habit shaped by time, armour against the day she finally slips or is torn from his life. She moves into space around the bed, absorbing everything of this surround. Her expression rouses a sense of faded youthfulness, her eyes wide and almost scared, her mouth clenched but not her jaw, her body a straight, slender vessel full of so much past. She skirts the bed, drifts to the far side of the room, her coat, forgotten, inconsequential, dragging behind her in whispers across the cheap nylon carpet. When she moves into the frame of the window, the pale, smoky noontime light transfigures her. The effect is startling. Her skin turns the glassy frail of a porcelain screed, slightly translucent, hinting at the branches of bone beneath, and the memory of a dream stirs in Michael's mind, years old and long forgotten, but suddenly real and clear again, and soaked in precisely this same light. One that captured her beside a window much like this one, naked to the waist, but with her hair still, with all its young length and fullness cascading in dark flumes down over her shoulders and small breasts. Standing in profile, head down, she was counting coins, brown pennies, from one hand to the other, and she was weeping. Not too bad, is it? She doesn't turn to look at him yet, and he knows why. No, he says, lying out of duty. Not too bad at all. We've known worse. The room is clean and plain, but determinedly sterile, with all trace of romance having been surgically removed. The sort of room suited to women on the run, and travelling salesmen, and those who wish to hide a while without being found, those who need time alone to think of good or even bad reasons why they shouldn't hang themselves in the closet or pull a razor blade across their wrists. But the cold strain of afternoon has added something more. It flushes through the tall, narrow sash window, a blanched, bulky light that thickens the air, melts surfaces, and slows the very turning of the world. And against that, every past and possible future collide with a clap and fuse together. They are held apart by more than mere distance. Her eyes find him as they find the corners, and the smile too is rubbed and far away. Well, she says, I like it. I don't know what it is, but the place speaks to me. I could write here. That's a thought I've not had in a long time, but this air is heavy with stories. Her stillness softens reality. To Michael's eyes, in the moment, she could pass for 25 again. Young, pretty, still slim as gathered sticks. The woman of his dreams, for better or worse, smiling but with the sadness that never quite departs her, and which always turns him 10 kinds of soft. The room, he decides, will be sufficient for their needs, but only because they have carried love in here with them, in them. That, and perhaps the peculiar quality of the gifted light. Stuff there.
That's beautifully. You can see this, the time and the skill and the attention to detail and the total absence of lodgers in those sentences. It's a very, very grown-up book. I mean, there is, and some parts deal with the childhood of Kathleen, but it's not really. It's really about adults, and it's. I won't say she looks at them, and they always talk about the possibilities. But the possibilities are never going to be realized, and she says, I won't say, it's like the best option is to do nothing, to just let him be. Secrets never stand a chance between them because they read each other far too easily. Dreams are fine in their time and space, but pragmatism is the key to survival. That and making do. And there is a sense of this is sort of a very, very grown-up book, a very mature book, and a very, very subtle book, and a book that deliberately leaves an awful lot of loose endings. I'm not going into how the book ends and everything else, but in a way that this book haunted you until you finished writing it, until you realized, no, this book had to be finished, and this book, and in a way also that possibly I could see publishers having to explain this, because in the old days, we say when Peter Strauss ran Picador and everything else, he could buy anything under 25,000 quid, and he had that sort of great power. There was those like publishers like Tony Lacey and Penguin and those who just had that power to, if they like something, they could just say, I love the quality of writing. Whereas now publishers have to go in and they have to pitch, the editor has to go in at a meeting and pitch a book to the sales and the marketing and all these people. And this is a book about two people meeting for 25 years in a succession of hotel bedrooms in Coney Island. And so it's unless you actually go into the quality of the text, you don't understand the actual impact of the book. This book is, I would hate to be in a boxing ring with this book, because I would feel totally seduced. I would drop my guard, and then it would knock me out with a really quiet punch. And that's what the book does the whole time. And so do these characters still haunt you, or are you sort of, are they now parked in your mind?
I'm over them now. No, I've too much else to write. Once I finished the book and once I could say it's done, I honestly, even when it was done, I never thought anybody would read it. I wrote it for myself. It had things from my own. I mean, I wasn't carrying on any, sordid affair for 25 years or anything like that. But there were things in the book that helped me make sense of stuff that was happening for me, And once I had done that, it felt complete. Then, the ending, people can take what they will from it. But I wanted to write something that wasn't neat. I didn't want it to be just in a box. They all lived happily ever after. And also, just going back to something you mentioned earlier about, there's a lot that's not said. There's a lot of kind of silences between, unspoken things happening. That's the way I see life. That's the way I see, people. People don't always say what they mean. They don't always say what they feel. At least the people I'm around don't. So it was just trying to capture that, and once it was done, I didn't know it was done until it felt finished. And then once it was finished, I could be done with it.
Yeah.
But it's true what you said. It's hard for publishers to look at something and try to sell the salespeople on a book, or this book has done incredibly well for me when it has finally happened. But I had no expectations of it. The same, and actually short stories are great for that, because you can have no expectations with a book of short stories, because nobody wants to read them. So I wasn't expecting anything from the book. I was always used to just struggling along, and so this one, it really took me as a complete surprise.
It's not just a book, but it's a benediction as well.
Well, if you like.
Your bank But I might turn to Christine, because these books are very, very different, because obviously adultery didn't come into Ireland until the Late Show. The world that you write about is a childhood world, and it's the world before the Late Show. It's that sort of.
I know the Late Show exists. I think
Show really is just when the whole nation gathered to actually get annoyed with Gay Byrne and then discuss them afterwards for several days. And it's that Dublin world where I always think of that those, you see them on Facebook, those old drink driving posters that said skip the fifth pint, or how many pints you've had, only have two more, and that's a world where women did go into lounge bars, but mainly they drank at home. And what I love about Tatty is that no voice is more difficult to capture than a child's voice, and getting the ring of that child's voice. And I think there are 3 books that do it brilliantly in Irish literature. And there's your book, there's Hugo Hamilton's Speckled People, and there's Pat McCabe's novel Butcher Boy, where immediately you go in, you believe in those voices, in those voices. And I mean, this book is very different from Billy's book in the sense that it is autobiographical in part. Although I think at the time, initially you said that it wasn't about you, because writers always need to create that sort of space. But it is, how those things have changed. It is partly memoir, partly fiction. And was that very difficult to go into your family life and begin to make a name? Because I think you said one time that you began this book as a form of therapy. It was suggested to you as a form of therapy.
Yeah, it was. It was really, after my father died, I went to a therapist to kind of help me to deal with a lot of things with the family, and with his death. And you know, you sort of open out to. I was very reluctant to go because you think it's a very American thing to do, but it seems more acceptable now in Ireland. But anyway, I went, and she said, "Why don't you write down your childhood? Write something down about your childhood, but do it from the point of view of the child, so you can see that children are not responsible for their parents' mistakes." And I did that, and I don't know whether it helped her, but one thing that did happen was that after a short while, I began to. It occurred to me that this would make quite a good novel. So The Ruthless Novelist came out, and that's how that really started. You know, how that started, and you know, and it stays with you for a while. But as Billy was saying earlier on, you let those people go and you move on to something else. But now, because Tatty is one city, one book, it's all come back again. And it's nearly, in some ways, more difficult to deal with now than it was in 2004, I think.
I think Tatty works on 2 levels, because it captures so evocatively that Dublin and Chocolate Lizard and all around there, and of the late 60s, early 70s, which when Ireland is going through all kinds of political crises and everything else, don't penetrate, because this is in a child's world. So this is a 9-year-old doesn't know what's going on. They're just trying to stay within the parameters of their own family. But there's a sense of actually, but it's not a period piece, because it is about the difficulty of a child living with parents who are heavy drinkers, and that could be heavy drinkers or anything else, and parents who love them, and parents who are not bad people, but parents whose personalities can change as the evening progresses, and you can have a very, very loving experience, and then 3 hours later you can wake to the sound of voices coming from upstairs. And so I think this book, it is the Dublin one city, one book thing. So I guess I used that at the beginning because we decided to delay starting, but it is a Dublin book. But I think that somebody reading this in Latvia, somebody reading this in Arizona would also my childhood, and it's my childhood now. I think that's a tragedy of the book.
Yeah, I've got a lot of emails from people all over the world. Not all over the world, but for where it's been translated, and they seem to relate to it because it's an ongoing problem. I mean, alcohol is a dangerous drug, not to say. I know it's great crack and great fun and all that, but when it gets out of hand, it can really take hold. And lifestyle, it doesn't really mix with children, I think. Something that can mix with children or family. You have to, if you're going to dedicate your life to alcohol, you have to kind of clear the decks of all else and do it if you want to. But if there's children involved and family life, it doesn't always mix when it's very heavy drinking.
Yeah. And the actual, I mean, people talk about therapy a lot, they talk about closure a lot. I mean, I love the notion of a writer going to therapy, getting the first bill, and saying, "Jesus Christ, I'm going to turn this into a novel."
Get my money back. Well, it wasn't very expensive. It wasn't a psychiatrist or anything. It wasn't very expensive at the time. I only went a few times. She was a very nice woman. But I do think that we do write things, again, as you were saying, Billy, that we do write things to make sense of our lives. And I had written 3 novels before this, which was an attempt to make sense of my father's life. And again, it was moving from short story to long form. And so by the time I'd finished the first novel, which was supposed to be just all about my grandfather's life, he was only 18 because, it was just keeping a hold of things. But with Tatty, it was the last book that I wrote about family about my family, and about trying to come to terms with it. And it probably will be the last one I ever do of that type, I think.
Mhm.
Although it will sneak into different parts and different characters, and it has continued to do so. You know.
Can I ask you to read a small piece from it, Christine?
Yeah. While we were talking, I was just about to pick up Billy's book instead. Secret wish that I was reading that instead. What did I do? Oh yeah, here. Sorry, excuse me. So while you were talking there about kids and pubs and Chapel Isidore and all this, Tatty spent a lot of time, formative years as I did, with her father, which would involve visiting a lot of pubs. So this just gives the flavour of the child within the pub. The barman in Mayo's gave her a packet of crisps called King Crisps. He gave her the crisps because she went across the road to the bookies all on her own with a very important note in an envelope. She looked right, she looked left, she looked right again. She went up on her tippy toes and stretched up her hand, and the man in the bookie shop pulled the envelope in. Then he gave her the envelope back with little coloured tickets inside. She looked right, she looked left, she looked right again. She pushed a big glass door in as hard as her arms would go. Then she was back in the pub. She said the crisps were the nicest thing she ever tasted and asked Dad if they could move to Castleknock so she could eat King Crisps all the time. Dad said she'd have to wait till she was big and then she would find a rich husband and live on Millionaire's Row. What's rich, Dad? Loads of money. What's millionaires? Loads and loads of money. See that fella sitting down there? He's one. I am in me arse, the fella sitting down there said. But Dad must have made a mistake about the fella sitting down there because he didn't even buy any drink. Only Dad did again. He took a big bunch out of his pocket, licked his thumb and pulled out a note. He pointed the note around at all the men's glasses and the barman blew out a big breath and said, "Same again, I suppose," like he was fed up of only Dad buying all the drink. The men said good luck to Dad. Then they looked up at the telly and started shouting at the horses. She ate all the big crisps. She ate all the small ones. She stuck her finger into the corner, scooped up the crumbs and sucked them off the top of her finger. Then she turned the bag inside out and licked it all over. The men stopped shouting. There was quiet for a second. Then they all burst out shouting again. One of them clapped his hands, rubbed them together and did a little dance. Then he went, "Yeah, fucking who?" And Dad said, "Here you, do you mind watching your language in front of the child?" They won loads of money and said it was all down to her. She was a smasher, a lucky star, the best little runner they ever had. But they didn't send her back out again. The man who said, "Yeah, fucking who," went out instead. And then she was raging because she would have loved another packet of King Crisps. "What's wrong with you?" Dad said. "What's the fuss for?" "Nothing. Nothing, the big fat nothing," Dad said. "No, just nothing." "I know what's wrong with her," the barman says. "I know why she has that puss. She's trying to stop the clock, that's what it is. She wants time to stay still so she doesn't ever have to go home again." "Don't we all?" goes this man sitting beside Dad, and some of the men sort of laughed. Then the barman goes to her, "I'm only codding you, chicken, I'm only joking. Here, just wait and see what I have for you now." And he climbed up on a stool to the shelf at the top. She could see his face through the mirror, all worried. First it looked like he was going to give her the little bird with the roundy belly that stood up on one leg and was able to dip his long orange beak into a glass, up and down, over and over, all on his own. But the barman's hand didn't stop on the bird. It moved on further and landed on the white horse instead. But when he came back down and put the horse in her hand, she loved him because he was smooth and heavy and stood still on a stage, and it didn't matter if he couldn't do anything on his own because he was so lovely. The barman said she'd have to think of a name for her horse and mind him very carefully. "But someone might break him," she said. "Who might?" "Just someone." "What someone?" "I don't know, one of my big sisters might, but by accident only." "Ah, you mean poor Deirdre. Poor Deirdre doesn't understand." "Tell you what, why don't you hide him from her? Put him up somewhere safe. That way she won't be able to touch him. And then when you're big enough, I bet you anything you like, your daddy will buy you a horse of your own." "That's right," Dad said. "When she's 10, she gets her own little pony." "Do I, Dad? Really, Dad? Didn't I promise you?" "Yes." Well then, they went into town. She wouldn't let go of the horse. They went to 2 more pubs and back to Myers, and she wouldn't even go to the toilet. They drove home down the bendy road where Dad always showed her how, if you look down, you can see all the lights of Dublin, and if you look up, you can see all the sky of the world. She sat in the front seat with her horse in her hand, and every time she slipped off the seat, the horse slipped too. And once she flew right off and banged her head on the cubbyhole where Dad keeps his silvermans. And the horse banged his head too. So Dad stopped the car and rubbed her on the forehead. Then he rubbed the horse on the head as well until they were both better. Dad asked her if she wanted a silverman to help her stop crying. But she said no, because even though they look nice, they always started stinging you the minute they got into your mouth. Why do you eat stingy silvermans, Dad? Because they take the smell of porter away. Why do you want to take the smell of porter away? Because the bold policeman doesn't like it. Dad pointed up at the roundy old moon. Look, he said, can you see it? See what, Dad? The roundy old moon? No, not the moon, the man on the moon. There he is, look, up there, walking around. What's his name, Dad? Nobody knows. He mightn't even have one at all. But he doesn't care. There he is having a nice little ramble for himself around the moon. I can't see him. I can't see him. That's because you're not looking properly. Calm down and follow my finger. See? She followed Dad's finger with her eye. She followed it slowly from the big knuckle up, and when she got to the top of his finger, she saw it was tipping the moon.
Yes, well, after
Beautiful.
Billy's outings, when she blots out to her mother where they've been, that her name comes from, and because her father calls her a tell-tattle, and it becomes a
Tell-tale tattler, he says, yeah.
I always felt that Tatty is actually a truth-sayer, that the simplicity of her story, the damsels with his wounded dignity and humour, and her ability to forgive even when confronted by actions beyond her comprehension. And it's the wounded innocence that actually leaves a haunting echo that readers really find hard. In the same way as Billy's book leaves an echo, Tatty leaves that echo there, you know. But was there,
Yeah.
I would say in Ireland, people always say that the Ireland of the 50s and 60s was governed by religion, but I think it was governed by the cult of respectability and by the sense of not giving away secrets, of not giving away family secrets, of locking them behind lace curtains, behind closed curtains. And because this was based on aspects of your life, aspects of your family's life, was there sort of a backlash or reaction when it came out? It's out quite a while now too.
Yeah.
So openly about, I'm thinking again of Nuala Furlong writing about her mother and her father in
Yeah.
Was there a bit of a resistance to that? I don't mean family, but meant from people who knew them.
From people outside or people who never knew them would say things to me, all right. And but I think, you know, and there is that sense of guilt, you know, that you're the betrayer within the family. And you know, like in the Hindu religion, the rat is a writer. Rat is the storyteller, because they travel on the boats and they bring the story back with them. And a rat in Dublin, or in a lot of places, is the one who tells tales as well, and probably because they go inwards and they come back out and they tell what's happened. And yeah, there was a little bit of that, and there is still a little bit of there is still quite a bit of guilt sometimes about being the one, the blabber, you know. Yeah, there is, I have to say.
And both you and Billy had written 3 books before the books we're discussing came out, and I know Billy, like, The Things We Lose, The Things We Leave Behind, your book of short stories received the what was the Cork School City book thing, and also received the short story award at the Irish Book Awards. And so there was, I mean, you both enjoyed success, but no success like these books brought on until then. And same way with Tatty, did you feel, in the way that Billy wasn't sure that Coney Island would be published, did you feel that Tatty wouldn't be published, or did you feel that it wouldn't have any impact? That it was
I actually, funny, and I never feel this about any books. Like my most recent book, The Narrow Land, I wrote that thinking it would never be finished, never mind be published. And I didn't really, I just wrote it as day by day. But with Tatty, I had a feeling it would be published, I have to say, to be honest, which is, as I said, like I've got 10 books written all together, and I've never been certain that one will be published, but something told me in it that it would be published.
Mm-hmm.
that case, you know. And it did make a big difference, I think. But it was published by New Ireland first, and then by Vintage in the UK the following year. And it has to be said too that it made me realise something more about the book business, because New Ireland had at the time a really top class publicist in Joe Hoban, and he knew how to make that book work.
Yeah.
But suddenly I was in this after, you know, it was my fourth book that people actually wanted to hear what I had to say. It was before they did with Allure, you know. So it did make a big difference in that point of view, you know.
I want to turn to the fact that you've not in Tatty, but in your book on in Cape Cod, you've both written about America and written about American loneliness as well. And what drew you to? Why is My Coney Island Baby written in that world of America, Billy?
I get asked this all the time, and I'm not really sure how it happened, because the whole thing was just so slow that coming together. I was always fascinated by Coney Island. It was a place that always, you know, kind of piqued my curiosity. I went there once for an afternoon years and years ago, and it didn't match up to my imagination. And I had read the Ferlinghetti poem, you know, the Coney Island of the Mind, and that much more appealed to me. Not the poem so much as the idea that a place can be more real in your mind than in reality, almost. And so there was something to me. It's a kind of there's something of a fairy tale quality about this. It's not quite, it doesn't quite feel real, these couple meeting up. I mean, who keeps an affair going for 25 years? You know, that's a bit of a fantasy. And so I wanted, because the main character Michael had come from Inishboffin, I wanted another island to play off it. Coney Island isn't really an island at all, as far as I know. It's the edge of Brooklyn, isn't it? So, but it fit my needs, and then also I wanted.
It's the Bray of America.
There you go.
We should be now.
Well, but the other thing that appealed to me about it was that it was long past its sell-by date. You know, that its glory days had been in its, you know, it had its heyday, and then it had kind of, and these were middle-aged, this was a middle-aged couple when we meet them, and, you know, they've gone past their peak, let's say. And so that was really the idea behind it. Sort of a metaphor almost.
Possibly research wasn't that much needed, because a lot of the book is in flashback, and Inishboffin is described very vividly and unsentimentally. The way that is that Michael's father dies in the field and isn't found for a few days, and all those things of Rhode Island. But a lot of the stuff on Coney Island happens indoors and happens in these sort of rooms that could be anywhere. And so did you feel any need to go and physically research Coney Island? Did you feel that you needed to actually go and walk those streets or those thoroughfares?
No, I didn't. I didn't want the real place to kind of impinge on it too much. You know, it was clear enough in my head from my memories of it and from my sort of imaginings of it. So I didn't want it to be something that you could follow on a map and go and see this place and that place, because that's not really what it's about. You know, it's not really about the place. It's about the people. And there is this sort of a kind of maybe a slightly past our sell-by date. And so the title
is Coney Island almost a state of mind.
Yeah, it kind of is. I mean, the title originally was called "Goodbye, My Coney Island Baby," and it was the barbershop quartet song. You know, And again, that played into this nostalgic feel.
Mhm.
And when I had sent in the book, that was the book that was accepted with that title. But then the publisher started selling some rights, and the French publisher asked if they could drop the goodbye because they felt that it was too suggestive of an ending when the ending was, was a bit more ambiguous, and they felt that it might steer a reader in a wrong direction or a fixed direction. So I mean, I didn't mind. I was happy. It still served its purpose for me. So I don't know if that answers the question.
You took a slightly different track with Cape Cod, Christine, because you couldn't wait to get there. I
couldn't wait to get there.
About the Edward Hopper and his wife, who spent their summers painting and crawling in that place. And could you talk about the origins of that book and your fascination with them and with the place?
Well, it had to be in that place, and I had to get a very strong sense of place because it's so associated with them and they were such a part of it. And it happened in two different trips. One was just a day trip that I took when I was at a book festival in Boston. And I knew when I saw the location that I really wanted to use it, and it was going to be important. And at that stage, I just had a little German refugee boy in my head, and he'd been there for loitering about the place for a few years at that stage. And it was really, after the war, President Truman had published a directive to get children and displaced children who were in holding camps all over Europe to try and get them, as many as possible, adopted into America. And that had interested me as well. So that was in my head. But the minute I saw Cape Cod, and I loved the light and the different, and this particular part of Cape Cod, because some of Cape Cod wouldn't have done, like you have the Kennedys, the Kennedy part, the Playboys area, and then you have Provincetown, which is a different vibe as well. But this is in the middle of them, and it's a very remote, otherworldly kind of a place. And so I took that home with me, and all sorts of things happened. And then when I was trying to do research, I'm sending off for books about the wildflowers and the sky of Cape Cod and the this and the that, and I just wasn't getting it to my satisfaction. So I went to the house, an Airbnb house on the same beach where the Hoppers had built their house, and the house still existed. Mm-hmm. And so I dragged the poor unfortunate husband over with me. He was very happy to be dragged over, I have to say. We stayed for a few weeks. And we were on that same beach, so you could experience the light and the stars and the wildlife and the remoteness. It's still very remote, and that really helped. And then it also meant that we could engage in a bit of light trespassing around the house of where the Hoppers lived, because nobody was that near it, and I couldn't find a way to get into it. But I invented a little imaginary dog called Rover, and Rover was always getting lost and running around the house, so I had to go chasing around the house after him, taking photographs at the same time. So I got into the whole thing about it, and that was great, and I couldn't have done it otherwise, so it became a part. It's another character.
I mean, and the book is a washing characters and great characters, but the character that stays with me is Mrs. Hopper, because she's a woman, and those are the great people to write. Those are the sort of that spiky.
She's a piece of work, yeah, exactly.
A very peculiar angle, and they carry that baggage. And what they see is clear, but it's like looking at light through a glass, where
and she is an interesting character. When I started off, I didn't like her, and then I kind of got to like her, and I felt more empathy for her. But I did soften her up a bit because I felt the novel was unbalanced. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure she would have been quite as kind to Michael. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, I tried to find her. But even though she's American, and this is the 1950, in some ways, some of the women I knew when I was a child were put into her. That dissatisfaction and that feeling that they want to be recognised as an artist themselves and all that kind of stuff. And she's just an interesting character, a feminist who hates women. That's kind of interesting for a start. And someone who adored her husband one moment, and then she vilified him another moment. And she was just a very strange woman.
And is she an artist to her fingertips in every sense, except not possessing talent?
That's exactly it. That's Dermot. That's exactly it. She's the soul of an artist, and she really wants to. And even her language is all very flowery and very arty-farty and all that kind of stuff. But when you looked at the paintings, that's the tragedy. When you look at her paintings, you can see that she had a flair, but she wasn't. She didn't really have any big talent, and especially compared to her husband, who had such a huge talent, such a huge gift.
It's interesting you say how you put some of women you knew in her. I want back to Billy and the question. He said, my first novel written back in many years ago was a little novel called Night Shift, and I'm set in the welding rod factory. It's the welding.
Oh, it's a lovely novel, yeah.
Right. Into world literature, and I'd worked that factory, but so there was bits of me in it, but the character wasn't me. But when I met my late wife, whom you would have known, Christine, and we were dating, and she read the book, and she used to begin to talk about being in Saks nightclub in Dublin and meeting lovely fellas, and then at the end of the night you discovered they were married. And then she leaves these like long pregnant pauses, which were totally over my head. I didn't know what, I wasn't quite following it. And then she explained years later that when she read the book, she just presumed that everything in the book was me. And that because this character in the book had got married to a girl who was pregnant when she was 17 and he was 18, and they lived in a caravan in her mother's back garden, she just presumed that I had a first wife in a caravan. and that she hadn't been able to separate me from the book. And so then I began to write a lot of books from the point of view of women and everything else, because I realized that there was a lot of me in the characters, but they were hidden away behind these maybe somebody of a different sex, so somebody of a different class, somebody in a different era. And you were saying, Billy, that in writing Coney Island Baby, that there was a sense of a lot of stuff about yourself in there. And so in all what you write, and maybe you as well, Christine, I mean, do you find that when you write something personal to yourself, with the exception of Tatty, which is a memoir novel, do you sort of find that you put up these sort of shields around it, that you disguise the person a long way from who you are when you want to be personal in your writing?
I don't intentionally. Usually, like I even though now I've written a couple of novels. I have a new novel coming out in January, but I still think in terms of short stories. That's where I kind of find my level in my head, and so my stories they tend to be things that I lie awake at night worrying over, and the stories grow from those things, and so invariably they're connected to me. Maybe it's a bit self-absorbed, but that's where the stories come from. And I have 4 books of stories written now, and I never have written anything that I imagined when I started writing it that I thought would be published. Yeah. When I do workshops or anything and I say this, people don't believe it, but it is true. I had this kind of constant insecurity that what I'm doing is no good, but I keep working at it and drafting it until it starts to become something. And the best stuff that I've written is the stuff that reflects me, or not necessarily, it's sort of the truthfulness of my circumstances or my life or, my surroundings. They're the things that I kind of cherish in writing. That if I can write something that satisfies me at that level, then I feel that I've written something worthwhile, something good. But I never worry about what people will think of it, whether they'll read it, what their opinion will be. And one of the things that I found with Coney Island, which really surprised me, was when the book came out, there was quite a few, in America especially, more so than here, people put things up on Amazon and, these websites, giving reviews, writing reviews, readers, there was so many people took offence that somebody would write a book about an affair. I couldn't believe that that this is still people's thinking. But to me, the book that the writer writes is the book. Whether you like it or not, you can take it or leave it. But people say you should have done this. It should have been this way, and it should have been about this, or you shouldn't have written that. That's not their business. The book is
in odd ways, it's not your business because the characters take on these lives.
Yeah, exactly. The book
your job is to simply, is to reproduce them as best they exist in your head, and if you try and shape them. I remember Colin McCann telling me about one of his early books, which is set in the subways in New York.
Great book, yeah.
And he killed off the character fairly early on, and he went back to work next day, and I found that all the characters in his mind had gone on strike. They're all sitting there smoking players cigarettes with a beautiful desk, and they wouldn't do any work.
Yeah.
He got nowhere, and then he realized that this character didn't die. This character had to live on and be a further part of the book. And once he rewrote the six things, that person was badly injured but survived the accident, all the characters stubbed out their cigarettes, picked up their picks and shovels, and started walking again. And sometimes you're not fully in control of where these characters go. But to come back to you, Christine, I mean, is there a sense at times that you find a lot of yourself in characters who are totally unlike you?
I think it's inevitable, because the one thing that a writer needs is empathy, and you have to be able to put yourself into someone else's shoes, and you have to leave some of yourself behind if you do it properly. So there's always going to be a little bit of someone, I don't know, do I see them? I try to see the world through my character's eyes when I'm writing. So I do recognize, but I do recognize in some things a lot of my father in different things, or his pals, or like one of my novels, The Cold Eye of Heaven, he's all over it. And his pals, and they're all over it too. And it just depends, and I might see bits here and bits there of things that I recognize that will be 100 miles away from me, but at the same time it's something within me,
Like for writers, the whole world is text, and every character winds up being an amalgam of 20, 30, 40 people you've met, and little bits of their lives
maybe. But I most of them I just make them up. Leave them. They're just making up people. Why I think a lot of writers, which I'll just say a lot, we're a little bit mad, what I say, because you spend so much time living with making up people that you believe are true, and you go away from them, or you push them away from you, and then you start to make connections with a whole new lot of writers again, and it's a strange life.
Well, we're coming to the end of our interview, and I want to thank Nessa O'Matney and Tanya Fallon and everybody who's been involved in making this, and apologies to people who wanted to see us in the flesh.
Yes.
In Bray, and one day we will be in the flesh in Bray again. Maybe in our swimming togs on the beach, and who wants to talk to us. But just to ask you both, in this pandemic, has it been productive for you as writers, or has the uncertainty clogged up your imagination in the sense of not being able to write, or have you found that you've been able to write well in it?
You go first. You go first.
At the beginning, I kind of maybe struggled slightly, but not really. I mean, for the last, for as long as I can go back when I first started writing, the one thing I've always had going for me is discipline, and I would always put in my days writing every day. Sundays and Christmas Day, everything, and that hasn't changed. But in fact, it's actually ramped up. So I find that I write until it gets dark now. I write from when I get up until when it gets dark. So I'm writing lots. Whether it'll ever be published or not is another question. But I am doing it. So yeah, it hasn't. It hasn't interfered with me in that sense, I'm glad to say.
How's it been for you, Christine?
Well, I find that I am lately, for the last, say, 2 months or so, I'm working full time as a secretary and a PA to somebody called Christine Dwyer Hickey, who I'm just doing constant kind of.
What's she like?
She's a wagon. I wouldn't go working.
I wouldn't surprise me.
It's rotten. The pay is dreadful. I find that I don't have the time, and I'm someone, I do have bits and pieces of a novel, and maybe two first chapters, and then a lot of little pieces of cloth to stitch together. And I'm anxious to get back to it, but the only thing that I've really felt that I've completed was a short story that's going to be aired on Christmas Day on Radio 4.
Yeah.
Other than that, it's all bits and pieces and a lot of distractions, and just trying to find the time now to just kind of immerse myself and write the new novel.
I'm sure they would come together. And a very last question for you, Billy, and it's a question that I know Christine wants to ask you, and that everybody in this call wants to ask you, and that maybe readers around the world all want to ask you. I hope you answer honestly, but did you tidy up your parents' attic afterwards?
You know, I didn't, and it's funny because I went up, well, it was already, there was nothing else up there, it was just rubbish up there anyway, but I went up.
Paste the thing now, you know.
Well, I went up there about 3 or 4 years, or a couple of years after, and there was still all the pieces, some of them had fallen down, but it was still, the wall was still decked in it, so it's, I don't know, I haven't been up there since, but I might have to venture up there again at some point.
You will, for the next one.
You can sell your parents' attic to some obscure American university, you know?
Yeah.
Well, Billy, you know, it was a great, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, it's a great way of getting, for anybody that's struggling to get to an end of something, keep it in mind. But it is a bit of madness, you know, it does take you in a dangerous direction, like, so, you know.
Yeah.
You do what you have to do.
Certainly, Billy, if anybody came into the house long after everybody's departed this world, and they saw this all, what would they think? They'd say some heck.
Yeah.
Call in the FBI quick.
They probably thought they were keeping someone up there.
Yeah.
Billy, Christine, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope we get to do it in the flesh.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Dermot, can I ask you a question before you go? You'd mentioned your short stories, but you didn't say what the name of the collection was.
Oh, the name? I actually can't remember now. It's called Secrets Never Told. My first story was published 44 years ago, and I always imagined that when I finally published a collection of debut collections, there'd be a big launch, but the launch consisted of me signing copies of it on the actual bonnet of my 13-year-old Skoda. The world has gone strange, you know. But,
yeah.
Thank you for talking to me, and thank for everybody in the for putting together. And One City, One Book, and good luck with that as well, Christine. Okay.
Thanks, man. Thanks. See you, Billy. Love you, Bye.